Ben.
It's me.
Hi, Ben. Hi, Tanya. Ben, I'm glad to see you.
Yeah.
I've been I was fasting from social media a bit today, not so much, some tweets a little bit, but also kind of hanging with my babies. The grandchildren were here most of the day.
Yeah.
How how was your Good Friday experience today, and how does it compare to what you've done kind of as a human over time? How was today like any other day? Passover Haggadah says, but also different.
Yeah. I preached at Princeton this afternoon, so that was a sort of different vibe. It was funny, it made me laugh. Erin, my partner, texted me this morning, um, and she texted R.I.P. Jesus, and then she said, "Spoiler, he comes back." And and that's sort of the energy that I've been like sitting with today. And I don't know if it's just because like the world feels so relentlessly heavy that to like sit with the cross feels like something I've been doing a lot every day. And so I yeah, sitting in that sort of that between space between trying to really, be present for Good Friday and sitting in a moment that has felt like Good Friday for quite some time feels like a sort of an irresolvable tension of sorts.
That's so interesting. Gabby was here. Gabby DeVoe, who's my daughter-in-law and also a member of our church, and we were having a conversation almost exactly like that, Ben, today. Like, what does this day mean? Of all the days that are like this. When I was a little kid, Good Friday was I don't know, it felt like a grown-up day. Like all of the stuff is happening. Holy Week is here. These days mean something. And Good Friday was a day I fasted, from the time I woke up until 3 o'clock. And my parents were like, yay, go spiritual chick, and then I got to go to McDonald's and break the fast, right? So today, as I was eating bacon, okay, not fasting, I was thinking about what did that ritual mean then, and what does it mean now, and what am I fasting from, and what am I fasting toward? And Gabby and I were talking about how do these days get infused with new meaning, given,
Mhm.
as you're saying, the sort of
Yeah.
ongoing, relentless cross upon which we find ourselves.
Well, it was interesting. They when Princeton was asking me what I wanted to preach on, they asked me to choose my text. And I preached a really unorthodox text. I didn't choose any of the seven last words. I didn't choose any of the stories of the crucifixion. I actually preached Mary Magdalene at the moment of the crucifixion, right before she encounters Jesus. So
Hmm.
lying at the tomb. And basically what I was talking about was that uh, so often crucifixion isn't just what happens when Jesus is on the cross, and it's not just in traumatic events aren't just time bound in our own lives to the traumatic event themselves, they persist afterwards. And so
Yes.
for me, the crucifixion continues, particularly in the lives of the disciples and the lives of folks like Mary Magdalene, long after that crucifying moment. And I think that for me feels like a really resonant place right now is this crucifixion, this crucifying reality beyond the crucifixion itself, that like we live in these structures of relentless death so that even in a moment where it's not happening right now, even in a moment where there has not been a mass shooting or a school shooting that I know of today, I know that there might be one tomorrow. I know that there was one, so like it feels like I'm constantly in this space of trauma, even if it's not the traumatic moment itself, because we become so habituated to these cycles of violence that even when the violent thing isn't happening right now, we are waiting for it to happen in the near future.
Right. That's really powerful, Ben, and really speaks to my experience. I found myself, and I'm not trying to shirk this, y'all, or not own this, but I found myself thinking this day is not a day that I need to mark as much as I used to need to have a mark. I've been marking this day since my mother died 6 years ago, right? Or I've been marking this day since George Floyd, or marking this day um, since Ahmaud Arbery. Like I've been marking this day. I've been marking this day all kinds of days since our fire. And so, in a way, and y'all forgive me, don't think I'm sacrilegious, but I did this. In a way, I inverted my sense of fast. I had laughter with the babies today, right? And we had, I have a really beautiful glass that I never use. And yes, God forgive me, I had a mimosa in the glass with the bacon. I kind of said, right this moment, I'm going to fast from my sorrow with Gabby and Joel and the kids. Does that make sense to you? Does that
Yeah.
resonate? Yeah.
It does. Well, and that's why I was sort of, led with that joke that Aaron sent me, because that's sort of where I need to be living in right now, is that even in the day when we're talking about crucifixion, I need to be holding on to that bit of the resurrection, because otherwise I'm not going to make it.
Right. Right.
Um,
And we know how the story ends.
yeah.
We think we know.
Well, and it's partly why, if I can pivot to crying a little bit, why I'm so captivated by crying as an emotional process, because it's a way of both being fully embodied and present in that moment of suffering while still simultaneously soothing ourselves and leading towards something beyond it. Like that act of crying inspires other people to take care of us. It inspires connection and solidarity, and it breaks the silence around suffering. Because I think that's the part that, is almost as hard as anything else, is the sense that we are living in these cycles of violence and nobody seems to be saying anything, that we are just expected to go back to work on Monday, that we're expected to, brush off the school shooting and just go back to our jobs. And the act of crying, whatever else you want to say about it, breaks the silence in a way that is noticeable. Like I always think about, that moment when a baby cries in the middle of church, everybody has to pay attention to it, and it disrupts the space. And I think, the more that we are able to do that on a regular basis, to sort of take in that suffering into our bodies and express it, and really name what we are going through, and name that, like, no, I'm actually really not okay when I have to continue to, live in this cyclical violence and just pretend like I can keep going on, like it doesn't affect me. That actually that act of crying affirms for myself that I am suffering. It shows to other people that I need support, and it disrupts silence in a broader sense, so that we don't just sort of live in this accursed numbness.
And it invites empathy. It invites connection. It invites, one time Dr. King said that a riot is the language of the oppressed. And I think your book, Cry Baby, helps us to think of tears as the language of those who are feeling deeply, deeply feeling the acuteness of the suffering, deeply feeling the mourning, deeply feeling the loss, deeply feeling the in between the now and the not yet. Gabby and I were sitting on a couch talking about, like, what is this day for? In the kind of almost a Passover way, like rehearsing it, like, what is this day for? What is the story in this day? And what's the suffering in the day? And what's the suffering redemptive then? This is, you and I as theologians, we don't think the crucifixion of Jesus is redemptive in that God sacrifices a child to make us well.
Yeah.
But what is it true that his suffering, the humanness of his suffering and his inevitable tears, right, Ben, and the tears, the anguish, the crying out,
Yeah.
does it humanize him and also humanize us as we reflect on it? Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think it does. The part of the crucifixion story that I've been sitting with this year as I was reading it, is this tension between Jesus crying out on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" and the tears that Mary weeps, Mary, his mother, weeps next to the cross, and then the tears that Mary Magdalene weeps 3 days later. And it feels to me like those tears are an answer to Jesus's question, that God has not forsaken Jesus, because God is alive in the weeping of the people who love him well.
Right.
And I think that for me is, as much as there is meaning in suffering, and it's not that, God desired Jesus to be crucified because God, wanted to make a baby to kill the baby, to parrot your language. But, that the meaning comes from when we are present to suffering and refuse to be alienated from it, refuse to say that person who is suffering, their suffering has no hold on me. When we make that purchase on our own lives, that gives suffering a meaning. And it doesn't, it's not a meaning in the sense of, oh, now this is a good thing has come out of this suffering, but it's a meaning in the sense of because we are inextricably connected, because I feel your pain so deeply that I've taken it into my own body, and I'm physically reacting, I now am living my life in a different kind of way than I did before that, that crucifying moment. And so I
Yeah.
think the disciples, Mary and Mary Magdalene, all live differently as a result of the crucifixion. Not to say that the crucifixion was a good thing, but the meaning that we can make out of suffering is real. Isn't it like the Viktor Frankl quote that that what makes suffering is pain without meaning? That
Right.
as soon as we have meaning that we can attach to pain, and it's no longer suffering in the same kind of way.
I think that's really powerful, Ben. It's really true. And there's something about, there's something about what is etched on our souls when someone else is suffering. When a baby stubs her toe, happened to our kids this weekend, or is wet and can't get comfortable, can't self-soothe. When I talked to Nelba Marquez Green the other day, and it's the day before her baby Anna Grace's 17th birthday, and you can feel the tears that are held in her throat and ultimately flowing. There's something about the tears of another, Ben, that I think help us to feel our own wet, sticky, vulnerable, right? Salty expression of sorrow, yearning, loneliness, all those things that provoke the tears, memory, right?
Well, and I think part of the reason for that is because we so often labor under this lie of isolation that we are actually the only people who feel this, because we aren't necessarily seeing that visible, marker of somebody else's pain. You think, oh, I other people must be able to handle it better than I am. I'm really, really feeling this in a particular kind of way in my body, but I need to just sort of hold it together because everybody else seems to be doing fine. So clearly, if I'm like gonna break down and lose it, like that's a me problem. I don't have my stuff together. And watching somebody else cry is then that, it gives permission to you that like, oh, actually, no, this is an intolerable situation. The problem is not me. The problem is the circumstances, the crucifying realities that we are living in day after day after day. Like that is where the problem is. It's not that I, as a result of living in, in that world, suffer because of it. We have this like relentless optimism of the American civic religion that grates unbearably against the violence of living in America. And like that tension is irresolvable up until the moment where you see somebody else break down under its weight, and then it gives you the same, that permission to do the same.
And we should break down under the weight. It is human to break down under the weight. It is the story of the babies in a community that are crying, and the elders put the babies all in the same space so they can all join in the cry. Something kind of chemical that's important, that's life binding, that's Ubuntu. I am who I am because you are who you are. Then in your beautiful book, that kind of tenderness that is evoked because we witness the tenderness of another, and it makes us tender, right? It cracks our heart wide open, and it's chemical, you tell us.
One of my favorite cultural practices is the professional mourners in various cultures, and you see it in Ghana, but you also see it in like Italy, and like there's really these cross-cultural manifestations of the same thing, which is that like oftentimes people don't grieve well, and we don't really know how to cry, we don't know how to grieve, and we don't feel permission to do so, and so you have these cultures that have developed professional capacities where somebody's responsibility is to go and be present at a funeral, to be present at a public memorial, and to just wail, and to do it in a way that is like so big and so over the top that it just it has broken that silence. It has created space for other people to step into,
like a vibration, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you talk about some of the chemical stuff. Yeah, it's really, really fascinating. One of the things that I say generally, at the top of the conversation, anytime we talk about crying, is actually we know very little about crying, which is wild because it's this deeply human, process. It's, a fundamental, it's one of the first things any of us do, we all start crying as babies. I mean, that's like one of the core essential forms of communication when we are born. And
Primary speech, one could say.
yeah, and it totally primary speech. And at the same time, there's been so little investigation in the physiological research and the psychological research into it. And I think there's some reasons behind that. One of which I think is that, crying is very effeminized. And we don't tend to regard things that are effeminized as worthy of serious medical inquiry. I mean, there's a fascinating new book on the vagina that just came out. And it opens by saying we actually have so little information on the vagina compared to the penis, because for the longest time, there was just this attitude of like, oh, well, beyond reproduction, A, it's not really worthy of inquiry, and B, it's like this mysterious, chamber that who knows what goes on in there. And so like nobody actually looked into it. And so it's only in the last 20 years that you've had any kind of like really serious, rigorous, anatomical research into the vagina. And I think crying, is in a similar place where it's very difficult to study. The way that they do crying research is they usually like show participants some sad movies and like hope they're sad enough so that you can get some good data of people who are crying. But that means in the best circumstances, you have this very artificial sample size of people who are able to cry in a laboratory setting because they've been shown Brian's song and they find it sad enough that it makes them cry. And perhaps that's not a great, sample to be generalizing to the entire experience of crying. And it's not the same, it's not like salivation or, sweating or other things that you can sort of, prompt in physiological ways. You can't just like make the room really hot and study how somebody sweats. It's a difficult thing to study. And because it's difficult and because there aren't a lot of like crying disorders other than, the ones we don't care about very much, like mental health things, they just have never done a ton of research into it. There's not a lot of money that, goes into crying research. And so we know very little. But what we do know is like tantalizingly exciting. Some of the research that happened in the 80s points to the possible existence of our lacrimal glands as an excretory function, that it actually concentrates certain concentrations of protein above the level they're in the bloodstream, that it's the only organ besides the kidney that, and it's not an organ, but the only gland beside the kidney that we know of that concentrates proteins at a higher degree than they're in the bloodstream. And there tend to be the proteins that are associated with stress. And so there's some speculation that perhaps it could be a way of actually excreting stress in a chemical way. There's been so little research that it really is not worth like, hanging your hat on that. Don't be like, it's definitely that. Ben told me. We really just don't know. But like we have these tantalizing possibilities. And I think we know from personal experience, anecdotally, that like when you have a really good cry, you feel different afterwards.
Absolutely. That's true. And in this journey that we're on, this journey from Palm Sunday to Easter to the new life, to the new life that's on the other side of this death, this crucifixion, this crying, the crying and the crying out are in the story, right? I'm fascinated that at least I can't tell in the Aramaic and Greek that the words when Jesus is crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Like it doesn't feel like they're saying cried and tears, but of course tears. Like how much pain could you be tortured with it? It's not tears, it's tears, and it's blood and it's sweat, and it's it's everything. And then it's Mary's kind of weeping at the tomb, believing the body is stolen, believing her beloved is stolen, and the kind of ongoing feeling that we have that her tears are both tears of sorrow, but also tears of relief. It is the I think I'm wanting to say, maybe because I've got Haggadah on my mind and Passover on my mind, but these stories, Ben, that we rehearse, that give us a chance to walk through the life cycle of mourning, of loss, of tear, of crying, of anguish, and then to the feeling of relief and release. Thinking about the disciples on the way to Emmaus, those ones on the road, and you're like, oh, we're so upset. And then like, wait a minute, didn't our hearts burn? So
Jesus is like, psych, it's me.
Like, boom, here I am, hi, it's me. But this, I think it's important, love, that these stories have in them for us an embedded permission and also words and language and scenery that evoke our emotional. I cannot. Our friend Ivan Anderson sang Gethsemane last Sunday
Oh
at
my
church.
God.
I need it, right? I'm like in the morning, I just want to say it. I
That's
can
stunning.
hardly hear those lyrics without my tears, bursting.
Yeah.
And I need it. I mean, don't you need it? We need
Yeah.
crying that the crucifixion story gives us. And all these crucifixions, dead babies, dead adults, fired legislators because they're standing up against guns, all these crucifixions, Ben, that are laid out before us to witness and also to have our hearts pricked wide open.
Yeah. I mean, to knit a couple of the things that you just brought up together, I think one of the things that we see over, like, part of what's powerful about the crucifixion narrative is this expression of public grief.
Right.
That we have, both Jesus's own expression of public grief, and then we have Mary and Mary Magdalene's
Right.
expressions of public grief as well. And the disciples, this collective public grief. And I think that there is a lot of power in public grief. It's one of the reasons why, the Jesus movement explodes after the destruction of the temple, is that you have this incredible grieving moment where people have lost, the center point of their religious life,
Right.
and they're looking for meaning. And that's when they seize onto this, this Jesus movement as a burgeoning, way to make meaning out of something that they completely don't understand in terms of like, how has God allowed the temple to be destroyed? And I think if, we fast forward 2,000 years, what we are seeing in the firing of legislators in Tennessee for standing with protesters is exactly that power of public grief and people who are very scared about that power. I think it's the same thing we see when they, deploy riot shields and tear gas to Black Lives Matter protests, because they understand that there is power in public grieving, that when people are able to express collectively how unwell we are, that it is a call to change, and people who do not want us to change would like to suppress that grief.
I want to come back to that, Ben. I had a chance to be on talk with Imam Khalid and with Rabbi Sharon on Brian Lear Show the other day. And I was really just thinking about the unwellness and how important it is to acknowledge we are not well. Like, we are not well. We are full of sorrow. We are full of angst. We are full of anger. We are full of the violence that happens when we feel out of control. So when I think it's Ramadan and it's Passover, and we've got Israeli soldiers kind of beating the crap out of praying people, right, in the mosque, in the holy site, right, the holy of holies, the holiest sites that both religions share. And I think about the way we also don't give enough permission for the vulnerability of the grieving. Therefore, there's rage. I mean, I'm taking a complex thing and making it simple, right? But if you don't have permission, access to the vulnerable space of crying and weeping and gnashing, you feel so squished by your pain that you end up raging instead. And that is, I think, a horrible situation that we are living with as well.
Yeah, no, I think you're 100% right. One of the chapters in my book is all about masculinity and crying. And one of the things that's really interesting when I, talked to, not interesting, tragic, when I talked to, men about their experience crying, is how many people were told over and over again that, not to be emotional, but like, there's this weird, dance we do in American masculinity where anger is not an emotion. Like, you can't be emotional, but you can fly off the handle in a rage. That's okay. That's not emotional. That's something else.
That's something else.
And when you tell people that they are not allowed to feel, when you tell people, oh, don't cry. There's, one of the interviews that I did in my book was this guy who grew up in the panhandle of Texas on a ranch, and his grandfather's admonition to him all the time was cowboys don't cry. And, if you're told again and again, cowboys don't cry, cowboys, and, he talks about how, when he was playing, Pee Wee football, he was told, if you really feel like crying, what you need to do is focus that into the next time you're hitting somebody and hit them harder. And so it becomes this really, really, clear suppression of, okay, well, I'm going to take all this stuff that I'm feeling, these uncomfortable feelings, this sadness, this grief, and I'm going to channel it into anger. And when you do that for long enough, what happens is it becomes habituated and you don't notice it anymore. And so then anytime you're feeling anything, it comes out as rage.
Right. That's really right. That's really important, Ben. Friends, Ben and I are talking like we talk, which is to say that we chase around ideas, and here we are. Just to say, when you're watching this another time, maybe to pick up a couple of points, we are speaking to each other on Good Friday, and we're speaking to each other about crucifixion and crying, and we're saying about atonement. We don't think God grew a baby to kill a baby. We think that systems and powers and principalities kill people who threaten them, and Jesus was killed. And we have grief about that death, just like we have also grief about all the Black and brown and poor and disenfranchised and on the margins people who get crucified in our empired structures and systems. And we want to hold up, I think, the beauty and power of the vulnerability that comes with crying, with grieving, that it is a strength to access. It opens portals to each other. And Ben's beautiful book, dropping May 13th. Do I have that right, Ben?
May 16th.
May 16th. Cry, baby.
A link in the chat here. There's actually Strand Books is doing a pre-order campaign where if you pre-order it from them, I'm going to go in and sign a whole bunch. So if you want a signed copy, this is your opportunity to, I mean, you can always find me and then, I'll sign your copy wherever you get it. But if you would like to pre-order it and get it signed and get it shipped to you, there's a link there in the chat where you can pre-order a copy and get it signed and shipped.
And way before it's May, this beautiful book that I had the honor to pre-read and blurb, Ben and I will be in conversation with a bunch of our amazing colleagues at Freedom Rising, as we think about how to dismantle fascism with fierce love. That's April 28 to 30. Ben's going to put that in the chat too. We hope that you'll share this conversation, y'all, and talk to your people about the power of vulnerability and letting ourselves cry the tears that need to flow as we think about healing our world. April 28 to 30. And I want to give Ben the last word as we head out.
Thanks, Jacqui. What I would just say to you who are watching is to know that your own tears are holy. I think we unfortunately grow up with so much shame around crying, and that more than anything is something that I hope that my book and anything that I do can change. We feel shame because we cry, we feel shame because we don't cry, and we are caught in these cycles where we don't know the proper way to exist in our own bodies. And so I just want to say that the way that you find yourself existing is right, that the pain you feel is not irrational, that living in cycles of violence like this is traumatic. And so to know that, to feel that, and to give yourself the permission to grieve, and know that when you do, you are actually committing a prophetic act that invites other people to do the same. The more of us who can show up fully, wholly in our own bodies, to speak honestly, and to invite other people to share their own grief and what they're moving through, that's what's going to give, be the stuff that allows us to change the world.